knelt on the ground in silence, just like protesters in the US. These members of the Economic Freedom Fighters Opposition Party staged a protest on Monday outside the US Embassy in Pretoria. They came to denounce racism and police brutality in the US and in South Africa. Apartheid ended 26 years ago, but white South Africans, who make up just 8% of the population, still control most of the economy.
Black lives matter, and it doesn't mean other lives do not matter. There is only one house burning, and we'll all pay attention to that house. It doesn't mean other houses are not important. They too are important, but this house is the one that is burning.
In Kenya, protesters drew parallels between police brutality in the US and in the East African nation. Kenyan police have been involved in the killing of at least 15 people since authorities imposed a nighttime curfew in March to fight the coronavirus.
We are sick and tired of the police brutality. We want justice for everyone, regardless whether in Kenya, all over the world, LGBT, anybody, Black Lives Matter. We just want justice. There's no need of violence. Nobody needs to be killed. Nobody needs to be beaten.
There was also an anti-racism vigil in Ghana this weekend, attended by Ghanaians and Americans.
There's stuff going on in my country, in America, that I'm standing up for here in Ghana tonight with you all, because you all are with us and we are with you. We are all Black people. We are all African people, and we're just demanding respect, unity, justice, equality, equity, everything. We are done being quiet.
I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
The killing of George Floyd has sparked protests in many different African countries, but so far most of them have yet to draw huge crowds.
Hey family, this is African Esquire TV, and I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. I wanted to go back to 2 years ago, and I did a video saying basically that Pan-Africanism was not dead, and that video was in response to a lot of people who were reverberating this idea that Pan-Africanism somehow was dead. It was not relevant to us in the United States. And, you know, back then, the most frustrating thing, you know, for me, you know, was that when people say things that just aren't true, but there's enough of them saying things that aren't true for them to feel like it's true. For example, the dumbest thing I heard, dumbest thing that I heard was people saying, people from Africa, they don't call themselves African, they call themselves Nigerian, and they call themselves Ghanaian, they call themselves Senegalese, they don't call themselves African, only we look at them as African. And that was dumb to me, because every single African person I know, they call themselves African. True, you know, you have you might have a national citizenship inside of a particular African country, but it's basically like people saying, you know, people in the U.S., you know, I rep Pennsylvania, I rep California, I rep Texas, and so people we rep certain states, so we're not acknowledging that we're Black or that we're African. We're only repping our states. No, that's stupid. Anyone who would say that probably never been to the U.S., probably never met people who have African descent in the United States, and so they're making generalizations based off of something that's not true. But that was probably the frustrating thing, was like so many things that just wasn't logically true. But the thing about the internet is a lot of people can grow platforms on misinformation, because unfortunately a lot of people look for people who are going to tell them what they want to hear instead of looking for the truth. So if you have a certain figure who is telling you what you want to hear, but hey, Africans, they don't like you, and maybe you already have had some negative experiences with continental Africans, so you have this person telling you they don't like you, they don't care about you, they don't even look at you as African, they don't even look at themselves as African. And because you want to believe that, because you want to buy into this person, or maybe you just love this person so much that you just want to listen to everything that they tell you and everything that they say, you are going to agree with something that just isn't true. Now, I have to go back to that, because I remember when I did that video, I had a lot of people saying, you know, some negative things on my YouTube. And, you know, the funniest thing, and when I say funny, I mean just sad and disheartening thing, is that you had a lot of people who look like me, a lot of people who are Black Americans, right? In my comments, saying things that a white supremacist would say to me, which only confirmed to me that the people who were leading this movement, or the spirit of this movement, was anti-black. Although they might say, oh, we're repping for the slaves of America. No, they were repping for the hatred against Africanness, and using that, the whole, oh, we're looking for reparations, as a guise to hide the fact that they hated themselves. If you hate Africa and you are black, if you hate Africa and you are African, you are hating yourself. You know, you cannot hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree. So that was really the guise of it. And again, that was just shown to me because there's just so much, you know, like white supremacist rhetoric, you know, like I expected this, to hear someone tell me to go back to Africa. You know, if I'm in Louisiana, if I'm in, you know, Alabama, I expect some white racist to say, hey, go back to Africa. I didn't expect that from people who look like me. I didn't expect that from people who are in the same political situation as me, the same political situation being that we are all inside of a system that does not value our lives, and that intentionally has conspired to put us inside of a situation where we're inside of a caste system. We are second-class citizens. We don't have the same rights that other people have just by way of us being African. But a lot of those people are in the same political status as me, the same ethnicity as me. Those people were saying things that were white supremacists, which let me know that at the heart of it, although it might be masked in black liberation, that was a white supremacist ideology and movement. Anyways, why was I going back there? I was going back there because it's just so funny how facts come out, you know, since then. And this whole George Floyd international outrage, this isn't the only thing that's come out. Like, a lot of things have come out since then. You've seen a lot of African people, for example, rally around you know, getting rid of French influence inside of in the African former Francophone countries. And although that is no way diminished, as I said before, you know, whenever you have racism, whenever you have imperialism, you have colonialism, it doesn't willingly change. It doesn't willingly go away. It evolves, you know. So you might have colonialism, but they're not going to give up their money and they're not going to give up their power. So now you have neo-colonialism. It evolves to fit the situation. So what we have, you know, inside of today inside of Africa, France may not have their currency, or might be willing to change their currency from CFA franc to some type of other currency. I believe it was called something like the Echo or something like that. But they might be willing to do that, but they're not willing to relinquish their control and their power over the region. That's not going to happen. But and regardless, you know, we're always pushing forward. We're always fighting, and we do have to understand that progress you know, revolution really happens in stages. So as your outrage, as the things change, your outrage grows, right? But in that situation, you've seen Africans all over the U.S. rally around this idea that France was colonizing Africa. You've seen it again with what happened in China. You know, Nigerians in China, they were being and still are being discriminated against, said they had the coronavirus, some foolishness that didn't make logical sense coming from the country that actually was the one where the coronavirus started, to look at someone who doesn't even belong to that country and say you started the coronavirus. But you had it, same thing with that. You've seen Africans all over the world rallying behind these Nigerians, mostly Nigerians in China. So many instances have just happened, right? But here we are with America, right? And we have a situation where an African-American man was lynched by the police on camera. And you have the whole world going all out against this. But in particular, you have Africa going all out in protest. So Africa, the same continent that they told you did not look at you as its child. The same people who told you did not associate you with them. The same ones that said they don't fight for you, they don't speak up for you. Yet they came out in full force, you know, in support of Black Americans, Africans in America. They came out in full support of us and solidarity and even protest. So what I want to talk about is, you know, to get off that subject, this is what really makes the United States nervous. You know, we're told that what makes the U.S. nervous is whenever poor whites and poor blacks and poor Chinese and everyone just get together. That's what makes them nervous. That makes them nervous, you know, but it doesn't make them as nervous. Because if you ever study history, what you'll know is that every single time that the international community became outraged at the treatment that the U.S. was doing towards a certain people, and in particular, we're talking about people who are of African descent in the U.S. Anytime that has ever happened, that's when you see things change. That's when you see people go out of their way to be over accommodating, and that's what we see right now, right? I mean, you had Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats kneeling with kente cloth around their neck. That was over accommodation. Now that was symbolic. I'm not hearing people, you know, call for something that's substantive as much as I would like, but you know, that was kind of going out of their way because you know that a year ago they would not have done that, you know, for any other person, right? But those things happen whenever you have a situation where the U.S. is being looked at as an oppressive nation and looked at and scrutinized for their treatment of their people. Now, if you look back at Brown versus the Board of Education, that decision tells a lot to us about how white supremacy navigates under pressure. So what I mean by under pressure was the international community was really condemning the U.S. at the time for the treatment of Africans in America. That was something that was going on. There was also a threat, a scare really, rather, of communism. They were afraid of socialism. They didn't want socialism in the U.S. because, of course, the U.S. is a capitalist nation and doesn't want to give anything to anyone who is not of a certain class. So, you know, those things being the case, there was a real coming together of the forces in the U.S. I believe there were probably many behind closed doors meetings that we'll never hear about, trying to figure out how do we appease the international community by making it look like we're going to do right by people who have African descent or black people, right? And in that case, what they did was they come out with this, well, this Supreme Court gets this case, and the president at the time, the president was Harry Truman. He sends an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. Amicus brief is basically a friend of the court. You could write a brief to the Supreme Court, for example, if you know that a certain case is coming up and you want to state your legal arguments for why you think that the court should decide one way versus the other way. So in this case, Brown versus the Board of Education, Harry Truman writes an amicus brief. And, you know, I think I have a part of this brief. Okay, so this is a quote, and I have this on hand for my own personal research, but a part of the brief, he actually says that, and as he wrote this through the Justice Department, he stated that racial segregation, before I say that, keep in mind, Harry Truman was actually a racist. He was in the KKK, you know, so if you're wondering why this is ironic, this is why this is ironic. He says, racial segregation had an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. Racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubts, even among friendly nations, as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. Now, keep in mind, this is not saying we need to do what's right, you know, or black people have built this country, so we need to do right by them. It's not saying that. It's saying there's a look that we're getting from the international community. It's something that's threatening us because, you know, at the time they were afraid of communism. So you should decide this, you know, forget about the merits of the case. Forget about all that. You should decide this a certain way because we're trying to brandish our image as a country because the international community is coming down on us, right? That is how white supremacy operates, in particular with us. Whenever there is a bigger threat, that's when you'll see concessions being made. Go forward a little bit. Go to the Civil Rights Act. If you know what was going on at the time, it wasn't just, you know, black people protesting. That was certainly something that was going on, but it was everyone protesting at one time. You had black people protesting, you had Mexicans protesting, you had Asians protesting, you had all types of people protesting, and then you had the whole world that was in disarray because the U.S. was in Vietnam. And when they were in Vietnam, they were committing mass crimes against humanity humanity. So it was a lot going on at one time. And the image of the U.S., when you had all these murders of black people, black civil rights leaders, you had all these things happening. The look that we had to the international, that the U.S. had to the international community was not one that they wanted to keep or maintain. So you've seen Johnson, again, a racist president, you know, and that's why I don't necessarily care about, you know, who's in the White House, because many times you've seen racists act against their perceived interests in order to accomplish their ultimate interests. But Johnson, he was a racist. If you don't know, Johnson called the civil rights bill that he signed, he called it the nigger bill. You know, this is documented. So this was a racist man, and he was actually willing to do something that he didn't believe in philosophically in order to appease the protest that was going on in a nation. Now, why am I saying all this? When you have the international community coming out and supporting people of African descent, that's something that makes the U.S. nervous. You know what makes them more nervous is when you have an identification that racism is global. When you have an identification of African people on the continent with African people in the U.S. saying that we have a common interest, we have a stake in seeing you actually overcome. We have a stake in this for you. That makes them more nervous, because if you don't know, what makes the U.S. more scared than more scared than an uprising of white teenagers and college students, what makes them more nervous is when the colonization of Africa gets equated with the colonization of Africans in America. That's when you see them get nervous, because that is what they don't want to talk about. All these people who want to talk about police brutality, all these people who want to talk about, different Confederate statues, things like that. Let's talk about something that is a systematic. You know, I really am waiting for someone to say every single person who is in prison in the U.S., they have to have a retrial. Let's talk about something like that. Let's talk about dismantling the prison industrial complex. Let's talk about dismantling U.S. policies. Let's talk about these companies who keep saying Black Lives Matter, and yet they're benefiting off of the colonization of Africa. Let's talk about those things. They don't want to talk about those things. And they sure as hell do not want Africa to start questioning the white supremacist policies that are being done over there. So understand, this is what's making them nervous. You know, I don't look at this as all these, you know, one day these corporations were going about their business and happy to be oppressing us, and the next day they care about us and they really care about our well-being, and all because of George Floyd. That's the craziest thing, if you believe that that's what's happening. What you're seeing what is happening on a global scale is people being nervous, because the more that Africans become conscious, the more that white supremacy is threatened. Because more than any other region, white supremacy flourishes off of the demise of Africa. And they flourish off of the political disorganization of Africa. Just the same that if you look at the United States, they flourish more so off of the political disorganization of African Americans than any other group. So we say this to say that we are making them nervous right now. The solidarity that you're seeing, that is making them nervous. And that is why we have to consider the fact that anything that distances ourselves from our African identity and our political identity, because this is a political thing that's happening. When you look at what's happening on a continent and relate it to what's happening to us in the U.S., anything that's going to dissociate yourselves from that, understand that that is coming it's coming against your interests, you know, to align yourself with something that doesn't align with Africa. Which is why in my previous video, you know, I did a video for We Charge Colonialism. We were saying that we want Africans in the U.S. to organize, come together, form a coalition, and on that coalition, we need to petition the African Union for us to be recognized as a member. Any type of recognition from an African body of our struggle, that's going to make them nervous. Again, let's talk about what happened back with Malcolm X. Malcolm X, you know, a lot of people, you know, there was a documentary recently talking about, oh, why was he killed? Why was he killed? You know, to me, I think there's a bunch of reasons why they felt the need to get rid of him at the time that they got rid of him. But the biggest thing that they were concerned about was when he started talking about getting Africans on the continent on the side of Africans in the U.S. Because what did he say? the U.S. has this image that we are pro everyone, that we're democratic, that we treat people right, that we honor your right to vote, that we do all these great things for U.S. citizens. Yet, if they really knew what we face here in the U.S., if they knew that in Africa, if they knew that in Europe, if they knew that everywhere, if they knew what we were really facing, you would see a total different outlook on the United States when they sit up in the human rights courts, and whether it be in the United Nations, whether it be in the Hague and Switzerland, whatever. When they sit up inside of those courts and condemn other people for crimes against humanity, for civil rights violations, for human rights violations, when they do that, and yet they're committing mass violations against people in the U.S. who actually built the country, if they knew that, it would completely change the dynamics of the international political scheme. So knowing that, he went and said, I'm going to go over to the African, at the time it was the Organization of African Unity. He said, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to tell them what's going on, and I want them to recognize Black people in the U.S. as a part of the African Union. So that was his ultimate plan. He didn't get to execute it because obviously Malcolm was assassinated. I think there's reason to believe that if he had lived and his vision had gone forth, that especially the Organization of African Unity at the time, which was, you know, heavily led by people like Kwame Nkrumah, who was a Pan-Africanist, who was educated in the U.S. He came to the U.S. He went to Lincoln University, became acquainted with Pan-Africanist philosophy like Marcus Garvey, went back to Ghana and became the first president of Ghana who led the country to independence from Britain, you know. So this is someone who is very well acquainted with racism in the U.S. He's very well acquainted with Pan-Africanism, with the belief that we were all connected. He was very heavily influenced by Marcus Garvey. And again, Marcus Garvey was not a continental African. He never even got the chance to step on his feet on Africa. He was a Jamaican who came to prominence in the U.S., obviously, but this man who's from this small country influenced the whole world and had African leaders from the continent reading his teachings and living by those teachings. So if you consider these things, right, consider the fact that he was actually trying to get the African Organization of African Unity to back him, and that's when they stepped in and said, that's enough. You know, we have to get rid of him. You know, they were spying on him every single country that he was in. They were trying to figure out, what is he going to do? Do they actually support him? Do they believe in him? Are they going to back this idea that African Americans are a part of the Organization of African Unity? That made them very nervous. And I think it's no coincidence that since Malcolm, we haven't seen a push for us to get recognition in what's now the African Union. So when we say we charge colonialism, we are going forward to petitioning the African Union. We know there are a lot of problems with the African Union. We know the African Union is still a colonial organization. We also know that it is the only institution in existence built to serve the interests of African people on a global scale. So when we say that we're going to go forth and get recognition from that body, understand that we are saying that we are trying to do something that should have been done a long time ago. We're trying to do something that would completely change the power dynamics, because if they did recognize us, and if they did recognize other countries like Haiti and Jamaica, if they do start recognizing that we are all a part of the African struggle, that's going to completely shift the dynamics of power. Because right now, as it stands, when they killed George Floyd, they had no concern for what would happen as far as Africans, how they would treat them. You understand what I'm saying? Like when they let George Zimmerman off, when they kill Breonna Taylor, when they kill us, when they execute us, when they do these things, when they assassinate us, they have no concern over what's going to happen on an international scale, because we have no backing. We have no international backing. Other countries, they have connections to their homeland, but we have none. We've been told that we are not of our homeland. We've been told that we should forget our homeland and believe in some reparations that are going to come by the same racist country that we're fighting, you know, that they're going to have enough mercy to give us something significant enough to actually repair the damages to us. The thing that I've always found, you know, interesting is that not only has this country shown that they're probably never going to give reparations to us, and if they are, this would be the time to ask, by the way, people. So, you know, let's get to organizing. But not only are they probably never going to willingly do something like that, but if they did, would it really be enough? Like, would it really address the problem? Would it really repair us from 400 years of mass hostility, devastation, deprivation? Would it really do enough to undo that? You know, think about the fact that this stimulus bill that everyone got, you know, they gave us how much? Like $1,200. I didn't get that much, but $1,200. That was what the most I believe you were promised as an individual. You were promised that much, right? Do you really think if they would only give out $1,200 to their people, that they would give us something that was going to repair our situation, repair us psychologically, mentally, that they're going to actually pour money into programs for us? You know, my thing is always learn from what's going on. You know, every single time that a program has been geared towards the Black community, right? Every time it's been geared towards us, even if it was geared towards us with good intentions, it's always been insufficient. It's never been something enough that was going to actually help us. And still, we're putting ourselves in a situation where we're dependent on them instead of being in a position of power to make demands, you know? So, all this to say, we have to understand that what's going on in every single country right now, whether it's Kenya, whether it's Liberia, whether it's South Africa, all these countries coming together and decreeing that you need to recognize these people as our people, that they are people who have rights and that they are not slaves to be treated any type of way. That global consciousness is something that we should be using to our advantage in a number of ways. One way is by us reconnecting to our birthright, you know, us being an African people. That is our birthright. The other way, though, is us understanding that gives us leverage whenever we do have outside influence to appeal to, whenever we do have backing from international bodies, albeit that the African Union is in no way, you know, more powerful than the United States. But what they do have is numbers, and they do have is influence, and they do have the ability to put pressure on this government in ways that we would not be able to put pressure on a government from within. So, all this to say, in conclusion, if you haven't been convinced by now, I don't know what else to tell you that Pan-Africanism is far from dead. And I certainly don't know what to tell you as far as you understanding that your only hope is that Pan-Africanism goes forward. You know, Dr. John Henrik Clarke said Pan-Africanism or die. Why did he say Pan-Africanism or die? Because if there is no Pan-Africanism, if we all are separate, if we're all fighting individually on our own little individual playing fields, then it's so easy to get rid of us. It's so easy to do wrong, to do us wrong. It's so easy to kill us. It's just too easy, right? I mean, what do they have to do as far as do something right by us? What incentive do they have? Whenever we're just a bunch of separate people who are fighting separate battles and without a common cause, without a common threat to the system of white supremacy, what incentive do they have to do anything for our good? They have none. And that's why it's Pan-Africanism or die. I understand without Pan-Africanism, we've been dying. And every time Pan-Africanism has been in a position to actually be fulfilled for us, they've done every single thing that they could to thwart those efforts. It's not accidental. It's very intentional. So let's understand that it's time for us to wake up and stop talking about things that aren't true. Stop reverberating things that are just false. It's time for us to actually look at the situation, to learn from our history and apply the things from our history in our present. And what history tells us is that we have no greater power than whenever we are recognized as an international people, and whenever we are backed by an international body, and whenever we are united as a people all around the world. So that's all I have on this, you guys. What are your thoughts? You know, and I will see you all in another video.